If the goal of welfare reform is to end welfare as we know it, the program is certainly succeeding in New York City. The municipal welfare rolls dropped 43% between 1995 and mid-98. Some of this represents a transition from welfare to work, and that's the good part. But much of the drop results from regulations and policies which make it a nightmare to get on and stay on welfare. What happened to these individuals? Adults and children? It's not quite clear, and should give us pause if we're planning to stay in New York for the long term and can't live on Sutton Place. In its enthusiasm for its version of reform, the city administration has seen to it that non-welfare benefits are being slashed as well. For example, by a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy, former welfare recipients and those diverted from even applying for welfare are not informed about their rights to Medicaid, food stamps, and child care subsidies. In other instances, when applicants do know about their eligibility for such programs, the city seems to go out of its way to make the enrollment process virtually impossible. The irony is, in all this, is that the city's policies are self-defeating. Programs supporting health and nutrition and daycare are crucial pillars for people making the transition from welfare to work. So what does the Giuliani administration really have in mind? Is it to turn welfare recipients into productive members of the society? Or is it simply to slash all spending on such social programs in order to score ideological points with the far right? With me today are two experts who have been studying the impact of welfare reform in great depth. Our own Ellen Amstutz, Community Service Society's Senior Policy Analyst for Government Benefits. Her work helps guide applicants through the often bewildering maze of forms and procedures. Ms. Amstutz is a PhD candidate at Columbia University, from which she holds a Master's of Social Work degree. Also with us is Timothy Casey, the Acting Director of Policy, Advocacy and Research of the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies. Mr. Casey is formerly Senior Attorney of the Welfare Law Center at Legal Services of New York City. Well, welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Tim, why don't we talk to sort of frame this issue by, there's a clock ticking, and I think people in our viewership have heard something about time limits. Well, what's happening? When do these time limits kick in, and what will it mean for the people on welfare in New York?
Sure. Well, the Federal Welfare Reform Law of 1996 established a new rule that said you may not provide aid to a child for more than 5 years in that child's 18-year childhood. So there's a maximum, but that's a maximum 5-year time limit on aid with federal funds to children. In some states, they've established lesser maximums. That 5-year maximum will probably go into effect in most states who choose the 5 years in 2001, 2002. But in some states, they've had a shorter maximum, so some families, some children are already being thrown off the welfare rolls simply because they reach an arbitrary time limit, even though they're still needy. In New York, fortunately, because we have a state constitution which obligates the state government and local governments to provide for the needy, New York has a time limit on aid with federal funds. But on the New York's program, if you reach the federal time limit and you're still needy and still complying with the work rules and the other requirements, you'll be switched to aid with state funds. So fortunately in New York, because of our state constitution, we're in a better situation than other states.
What kind of aid will happen in that sort of state system?
It will be the same amount of aid that people are currently getting under the existing system, which is inadequate.
Right.
It's half the poverty level, but it won't be any reduction in aid.
Mm-hmm. And it will be in cash, or is it?
Well, there'll be more of a use of vendor type aid rather than cash type aid, so a more stigmatizing type of aid than a cash grant, which most people get in most cases now.
Right. So in other words, your landlord.
Your landlord, yes. That happens fairly frequently today, that if you're on welfare, your rent will be paid directly to your landlord rather than to you, so you lose your leverage with the landlord to get repairs and the like. But that will happen if you go over the time limit in more cases.
How does it look in terms of the welfare reform that was passed by Congress and what's happened in the city from your vantage point? Is the Giuliani administration just implementing as a rubber stamp the welfare reform policy that was envisioned in Congress?
No, I think, well, I'm not sure Congress had a single vision. I think that there's really been a dual conservative vision of welfare reform. and then two visions really contradict themselves. And the Giuliani administration has actually embraced both. So we have sort of the worst of both worlds. One vision of welfare reform was simply stopping welfare, getting people off the welfare rolls regardless of need. And that's certainly been one of the main initiatives of the Giuliani administration, making it extremely difficult for needy people to access benefits. And we've seen many studies, many court cases saying that people who are needy and poor are being kept off welfare in New York City. The other vision of conservative welfare reform was welfare reform as work. In Mayor Giuliani, I guess when he made his speech a year or two ago promising to end welfare by this time, by the beginning of the year 2000, he embraced that vision. He said, my real objection to welfare is not that people are getting government benefits. That's not what I object to. But they're not doing something in return. So when he said that he was promising to end welfare by the year 2000, what he meant was he was going to make everyone on welfare work, who was able to work. Recently, he proclaimed that he had succeeded in doing that. He had either everyone now on welfare was either working or too disabled to work by his own statements. And yet, nevertheless, having embraced this vision of welfare reform as work and saying, I don't object to people getting assistance if they need it, if they're willing to work for it. There's a contradiction between saying that and then having policies that make it extraordinarily difficult for people to access their benefits. If people are being made to work for their benefits, what's so terrible about making those benefits available?
Well, Ellen, let's talk about what's it like. You in your work, have some direct relationship in terms of watching what's happening to people as they try to access their benefits, as they're removed from the rolls. What is the picture for somebody who's caught up in this system?
Okay. Well, there's two groups of people that this is affecting. These are those people that are applying for welfare for the first time. Maybe they've suddenly become jobless, they're in some kind of financial crisis, and they go to a welfare center to try to get benefits to support their families. And a second group that we're concerned about as well is those that are leaving welfare, and leaving welfare either because they find jobs or because of the city's policies that have just worn them down and caused them to have their cases closed. So let me talk about that latter group first. Both groups are obviously of great concern to us. That group that's leaving welfare, we don't know what's happening to them. The city is not collecting data on them. There's no cooperation with universities or researchers or foundations.
This is sort of unique. Other municipalities are actively engaged in research. In New York, it's not so.
Well, most places care about implementing good policies that help people.
Showing our biases here, okay.
Yes, there's welfare studies going around across the country.
Except in New York.
Except in New York City. We're doing the state is doing a little bit better, but in New York City, there's been one study, a 1998 study of 1997 welfare leavers where the city made a half-hearted attempt to follow some welfare leavers. So we have a little bit of data. And from that data, from what we see what's happening across the country and from the evaluation that the state has done, we think that about between half and optimistically 2/3 of people that leave the welfare rolls are getting jobs. Now, what kind of jobs those are and how much they're being paid and are they able to support their families on those jobs, we're not so sure about. They're certainly not going above the poverty level in any great numbers. A few of them aren't doing very well, but for the most part, people are becoming poor welfare recipients and now they're poor workers, which philosophically they're working and maybe that's good in and of itself. But what we're seeing is happening is they're losing supports. They're becoming uninsured. They're not able to access food stamps, which would supplement their income and help them feed their families. They're paying out of their own pockets for child care, and because they don't have a lot of disposable income left when you're below the poverty level, they're not able to provide good quality child care for their children. What's ironic about all of this is there actually are some benefits in place for those people, but the city has created barriers to access those benefits. People should be entitled to a full year, definitely 6 months, and in most cases a full year of transitional Medicaid. In other words, they should have access to their health insurance benefits when their welfare case is closed. The city is not providing that to people, not telling them it's available. Let me just tell you a case that illustrates that. We help people access benefits at the Community Service Society. We had a man who had recently left the welfare rolls. He found a job. He was the sole caretaker of his teenage son. He did what the city told him to do. He found a job and he closed his case. He came to the Community Service Society because he had no health insurance, and suddenly his teenage son had an illness that required medical care. He wanted to know what his health insurance options were. As we talked to this man, we found out that he had been on welfare 4 months earlier and should have been on Medicaid for 6 months, and according to his income, a full year after that. So as we talked to him and found out, well, why didn't you get this transitional Medicaid? The scenario went, he told his caseworker that he had found a job, and the caseworker asked him, do you want your welfare case closed? And he said yes. So he was coded in the computer as somebody who requested his case be closed.
And therefore not entitled.
Right, rather than saying it was closed because he found a job. So it's just a little snafu in the system where the city is not going out of their way to get people onto benefits entitled. Unfortunately, there's no way to go back in the city system to restore Medicaid for this man. The son was not entitled to Medicaid. Their income was slightly above the community Medicaid levels, and this family lost out.
But that's the kind of scenario. Tim, what are you seeing from some of the things that the Federation is looking at?
Well, basically, I think Ellen outlined the problems that we're seeing. One problem is some people who are leaving welfare, very large portions, probably from quarter to half, apparently have no employment at all. So it looks like they're just being pushed out of the system, even though they're...
And what happens to them?
Well, again, the city, as Ellen said, has no system for really trying to track and monitor groups like the Coalition for the Homeless and the Coalition Against Hunger. They monitor use of food pantries and homeless shelters, and they've reported substantial increases in requests for emergency food and in homelessness. So presumably people with no income, no means of support, many of them turn to the emergency food system and to the homeless shelter system, which obviously isn't a good outcome. Another problem we're seeing, I think Al mentioned, many people who leave welfare who do have jobs, their pay rates are such that they're still very poor. So we need to do something about raising wages at the bottom, and we need to make sure they access benefits which supplement low wages. And then we have the problem with people who are still on welfare, who are complying with the work rules, many of whom are working. In New York City, we have roughly 40,000 people in the WEP program. But because the WEP program work isn't considered real work for other benefits purposes, they can't get, for example, the Earned Income Tax Credit. They don't get credit.
It's not considered real work.
No, it's not considered real work legally in terms of earnings. So it's a discriminatory system. So they're on welfare, they're working, they're doing everything that they've been told to do. They're working 35 hours a week. But
they are. It's not. It's 35 hours a week.
Yes, not technically in WEP, but they now have the basic program for everyone is to try to make you do 35 hours of something a week. It isn't always all WEP, depending upon your actual grant. But your grant is still only half the poverty level. So here are people who are doing everything that society asks of them, who used to be accused of not holding up their end of the social contract, and they're holding up their end of the social contract, but their living standards are still incredibly depressed.
I remember this sort of hit home to me while I saw a group of African American and Latino middle-aged people. They were clearly all in their 50s. Maybe I'm particularly sensitive now that I've hit 50. Sweeping in near Prospect Park. Surrounded by a whole host of rollerblader yuppies. It was one of the more horrifying views I've ever had of a change in society, a kind of indentured servitude that we seem to be moving towards. But there were so many racial issues involved in it and overlays that it has a certain, if this is the future for New York, we're in for a real tough time.
Right. Yes, I've seen similar scenes. I rollerbladed on the West Side, and you see these WEP workers just cleaning the sidewalks and making puddles smaller so we don't get our rollerblades too wet as we rollerblade. And again, I just want to emphasize one point. In criticizing the WEP program, we're not, as was sometimes mischaracterized, objecting to people working. We're objecting to the fact that they're not compensated fairly.
Well, and in addition, of course, even if you do sterling work as a WEP worker, there's no record which you can take on to other employers. And I guess even, obviously, the other abuses, they haven't been following workplace safety rules either. So this becomes more like indentured servitude than it comes from real work.
Yes, the Giuliani administration has actually taken a position that people in the WEP program don't have the protection of the laws that protect against, for example, sexual harassment.
That's right.
They don't get credit under Social Security, on unemployment compensation, on the Earned Income Tax Credit. so they get none of the benefits that most workers get.
And there have been at least a couple of deaths, obviously, because
Yes.
people have been
Yes.
put in assignments where
Yes.
their health condition
Yes.
was looked at, they wouldn't have been allowed to go to.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about job, obviously some in the advocacy community have been put down as not in favor of work. Let's talk about the job centers. How effectively are the job centers working? What is that like, Ellen? Do you have any sense?
Job centers is a misnomer. What's happened is about half of what we used to call the income support centers have been converted to job centers. And we would think by the name that they're a place where people can go and get assistance in finding a job and be counseled on benefits that would support them as they find low-wage work, that is work that isn't earning enough to support their families. But what happens is the city has implemented a whole array of diversion tactics to try to discourage people from submitting a welfare application, even to the point of not giving them an application. And you have to remember that when people finally make their way to a welfare center, they're really in crisis. People don't
Just
put themselves through this experience because they want, they don't want to work.
Well, for our viewers who've never been through it, what's it like? What happens? I come to the door, and do I get seen? What happens when I try to make the application?
Well, you meet with someone, and that caseworker will try to discourage you from applying. You're told to come back a few days later.
And these are people in crisis.
Yes, yeah. And people should, if they are in a crisis, if they don't have money to buy food to feed their children that day, they should be seen immediately, and they should be offered emergency assistance, and very often that's not done as well. The people have a right to have their immediate needs met if they're in a financial crisis when they walk into a center. So they're immediately set up with job search requirements, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but what should happen is, in addition to those job search requirements and assistance in finding a job, is people should be told that they're eligible for Medicaid, that they should be told that they're eligible for food stamps, and even if either A, they find a job, which would be wonderful, or B, they decide that welfare is just not something that they want to get involved in, they should certainly have their immediate needs met. They should be given a Medicaid application, because chances are, if they do find a job, they're not going to have health insurance in that job, and they should be processed for food stamps, because again, if they find a job, overwhelmingly people in this group continue to be eligible for food stamps. And we've got to, what I think is required here is the city really has to have a fundamental shift in their thinking about these benefits. Welfare, food stamps and Medicaid are not necessarily welfare benefits. They're benefits that support low-income people. And the federal government has certainly made this message clear to the states. Other states are also not doing such a great job of hooking people up with Medicaid and food stamps, but nowhere are the policies so harsh as in New York City.
Just to underline something that Ellen said, and to make clear, it's not just the advocates who are saying this. A federal court has found systemic denials, violations of law in the Job Center initiative, and has blocked the city from further extending the job centers until it cures those illegal denials. And recently, the Federal Office of Civil Rights found systemic violations, denials of rights in the Welfare Administration as it applied to people who did not speak English and people with hearing disabilities. So it's not just advocates, it's federal courts, federal agencies. Let's
talk about child care. That's one of the transitional benefits people are supposed to get. Tim, what is the status now for child care supports?
I see two or three major problems. One, that many people leaving welfare who are entitled to continued child care benefits just don't get them. There are numerous problems in the switchover from welfare to the post-welfare status, where even though you're legally entitled to child care, you don't get it. A second problem that we see is that many single parents on welfare are now working, and of course while they're working, the children have to be in child care. And what we find the city doing is funneling children whose parents are on welfare and engaging in the WEP program into informal, unregulated care. One study by the public advocate, I think 2 or 3 years ago, found that if you entered the city's subsidized child care system, other than through the welfare work programs, 80% of the time, at least 80% of the time, you wound up in a child care center that was regulated and inspected, so you had some security that your child was being well taken care of. Whereas if your child went to child care through the welfare system, then 80% of the time the child wound up in informal, unregulated care.
You know, I've been going over some of the history of the Community Service Society. We're 153 years old, similar in Federation being old. One of the reasons it was founded, actually, was the scandal before the turn of the century of informal childcare. At that point, the scandal really was people taking in foster kids and taking the allotment for food and housing and letting the children starve. And this happened to thousands before it became one of the biggest scandals, which actually rocked the Tweed administration and the Democratic administration, because there was all sorts of frauds here. And much of the reaction of advocates of those days was basically to set up a child care system that was regulated. And to suddenly be going in reverse, basically back not only 20 years or before the New Deal, but actually going back to the turn of the century is a fairly frightening precedent. In terms of the ability of somebody to get their child into a regulated child care, is there a possibility? Can someone do that?
Well, Ellen may have better be able to answer than I, but in our experience, if you're on welfare, they give you an incredibly, you come in, they basically communicate to you, you must get child care within some incredibly short period of time, 5-6 days, and they don't really help you. But they sort of suggest that you find a neighbor, friend, something like that. They don't direct you, and if you do try to get into the regulated care, often there are waiting lists. So the time, either you're not giving assistance, or the period they give you to try to find childcare just isn't enough to get into a regulated center.
No?
Yeah. Well, we do in the city have a good system of regulated childcare through the city's Agency for Child Development. There's about a little over 60,000 slots for children. 60,000 slots for children in this city is just not enough. And for the most part, what we hear is those, that generally they're good quality slots. We've got a lot of working poor families in New York. The waiting list to get into one of those slots in certain neighborhoods is well over a year. If your caseworker is telling you your case is going to get closed unless you get child care, you don't put your name on that waiting list. You go and find any kind of means you can to take care of your child, which unfortunately are often very shaky situations. They're not situations that are going to enable somebody to really go to work, to get skills, to get a job. These informal arrangements that they put together haphazardly and quickly. And they do that because they're pressured to do that by the system.
Ellen, give me a picture of the jobs that people are taking as they come off welfare. What are the jobs generally that we hear from our clients and people we're working with?
Well, they're low wage. They're service sector jobs. They're many clerical jobs. Working in stores. What we hear is they don't get benefits, that their hours vary quite a bit, that one week they can have 35 hours of work, and the next week they go to work and they say, we don't need you, we only need you for 15 hours a week. I remember one situation, a client that we had got a job as a home attendant, and whenever she worked over 20 hours a week consistently, she got her health care benefits. When her hours dropped below 20. So whenever one of her elderly clients that she cared for no longer needed there, and they would try to place her, she'd get a new job. So she never knew whether she and her children were going to get covered with medical care.
Right. With time limits coming to an end, what role is the economy playing in the ability of people to either, who have made the transition, quote, from welfare to work to sustain that, or obviously, are we going to see new floods of people seeking some kind of support? Tim, do you have any?
Well, I think the low unemployment rates, relatively low unemployment rates of recent years, are good news, and to some degree they've helped contribute to a relatively minor drop in poverty, and particularly child poverty. But if we look now at child poverty rates, as CSS has done,
right.
When the unemployment rates of the 1970s even higher than today, we find that child poverty was much lower back then, even though unemployment was higher. So what this suggests is that when the economy turns around again, as it inevitably probably will, the residual child poverty rate and the overall poverty rate is going to soar. So there's a real concern that it's good that we're having low unemployment. That's helped reduce poverty. What happens when that turns around? Where there's going to be a huge increase in the number of people going to need aid will be available.
Ellen, Tim, thank you very much. Much of our discussion today has focused, as it should, on the treatment being meted out to individuals trying to move from welfare to work. City Hall's view seems to be that the continuation of any kind of benefit program is a symbol of dependency and is therefore bad. That apparently is why it is discouraging Medicaid, food stamps, and child care, along with welfare benefits themselves. But if these benefits were viewed in a business context, a different perception could emerge. That development of a labor force is a form of investment, just like any other research and development, and therefore are overhead costs associated with it. The medical insurance, the food and child care needed to sustain welfare leavers is just part of the development cost. If the program is successful, the payback in terms of productivity and wealth created will far exceed the investment cost. Here, success would mean that chronic welfare recipients become perpetual earners and taxpayers. Maybe a hard-headed business view of these expenditures would remove the stigma that City Hall seems to attach to them. If so, even conservative economics would dictate that those moving from welfare to work not be deprived of the support they need to aid in their transition. This is David R. Jones for the Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.